In 1979, Jerry West resigned as head coach of the Los Angeles Lakers, and after a quick search, Jerry Tarkanian, the coach of the UNLV Running Rebels, was set to be hired as his replacement. Lakers owner Jerry Buss met with Tarkanian's agent Victor Weiss on the night of June 13, 1979, in Los Angeles to negotiate a contract. And that meeting with Buss was the last time Weiss was seen alive. He went missing after leaving the meeting, and 4 days later, his body was found stuffed in the trunk of his Rolls Royce. He'd been shot twice in the head, and his hands were tied behind his back. It was a pretty obvious mob killing, and the fact that Jerry Tarkanian's agent was murdered in a mob-style killing after meeting with the Lakers was a real mystery. But that wasn't even the craziest part of the story, because during the investigation into his murder, it was learned that Victor Weiss had ties to a scandal that nearly became one of the biggest scandals in sports history, and it involved the mob paying off referees to fix NFL games. When Victor Weiss's murdered body was found, he was still wearing an expensive diamond pinky ring and a $6,000 Rolex watch. Since they weren't taken, police ruled out robbery as a motive. Tarkanian, who was set to be hired for probably the most desirable coaching job in basketball, withdrew his name from the Lakers' job search because he claimed he was so affected by Weiss's death. With Weiss's dead body as the only clue, police began investigating Victor Weiss's background. His public image was a wheeler-dealer millionaire businessman, but it was soon learned that he was a man who led a secret life. For starters, he wasn't really even an agent. Tarkanian was the only coach or player he represented. It was said that Weiss and Tarkanian were friends from college, and Weiss was serving as Tark's agent as a hobby. Weiss claimed he was a boxing promoter, a land developer, and a partner in various car dealerships, though it was learned that none of these had really panned out, and at the time of his death, he was heavily in debt. But the most interesting thing about Weiss was that it was claimed he was a bagman, a person who collected and delivered illegally obtained money for others. An informant told authorities that an unknown individual frequently stopped by the auto shop Weiss worked at and left a large brown paper bag filled with what was believed to be money. The next morning, Weiss would take this bag and make a trip to Las Vegas, drop off the bag, then travel back to Los Angeles in the same day. Leroy Orozco, the police detective investigating his murder, said Weiss was definitely a bagman for some Vegas people. Weiss came up on phone records at a place called The Gold Rush, a jewelry shop in Las Vegas owned by Tony Spilotro. Now, Tony Spilotro was probably the most brutal mob figure in Las Vegas of this time. Joe Pesci's character in Casino was actually based on Spilotro, and the scene where he crushes a guy's head in a vice was apparently based on a true story. Authorities also uncovered links between Weiss and LA crime boss Frank Bompensero and Michael Rizzatello, who were associates of the notorious Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano. It was speculated that Weiss was murdered because he was skimming money while serving as a bagman, essentially stealing from the mafia. But it was soon learned that there was also much more to Victor Weiss's story, because at the time, the FBI was investigating reports that the mob was paying off referees to fix NFL games and then betting and winning massive amounts of money on these games. And during this investigation into the fixed NFL games, Victor Weiss's name was mentioned prominently. In 1979, the Houston office of the FBI received news from a source that underworld figures were fixing NFL games by paying off referees. Anthony Vaccarino of the FBI's Organized Crime Division claimed these 8 NFL games during the 1979 season were fixed. The source claimed a network of car dealers in Houston were working with a mafia figure in New York to pay off 2 to 3 referees to fix these games. This informant took a polygraph about these allegations on February 4, 1980, and passed. Shortly after that, a television reporter in Chicago met with a source who said that NFL referees were being paid $100,000 each per game to fix games for the mafia. The TV reporter gave the FBI a list of the games that the source had claimed had been fixed, and the reporter's list of games matched up with the games that were already on the FBI's list. This was independent confirmation that something was potentially going on. In an FBI report about the NFL game-fixing scandal, Victor Weiss's name was prominently mentioned. Even more interestingly, the report linked Weiss to Carroll Rosenbloom, the multimillionaire owner of the Los Angeles Rams football team. A Chicago bookmaker who was also a federal witness said Weiss was Rosenbloom's bagman. He had held out on some money on some games they were doing business on. He was $200,000 in debt from the previous year and was skimming. The problem was, Rosenbloom wasn't running the show. Other people were involved, and most of them were from Vegas. Now, this was a bombshell. If Weiss was serving as the bagman for Rosenbloom, who, again, was the owner of the LA Rams, was Rosenbloom making all this money from betting on his own team and even potentially fixing NFL games? There were indications that's exactly what he was doing, and it almost became the biggest scandal in NFL history. Carroll Rosenbloom was an interesting, very colorful character. He was described as a ruthless businessman who owned many notable companies, including Warner Media. He was best friends with movie stars, singers, and even the Kennedys, and was a frequent golfing partner of JFK. He bought a majority stake in the Baltimore Colts for $13,000 in 1953 and made a fortune as the NFL's popularity exploded. From the start, there were allegations that he was heavily involved with not only gambling, but betting on his own team. Sports Illustrated wrote articles about Rosenbloom's gambling on NFL games, and many associates of Rosenbloom's confirmed this. Mike McClaney was a business partner of Rosenbloom's who said, "We formed a business relationship for the purpose of betting large sums of money on football games. On one occasion, for instance, Rosenbloom bet as high as $55,000 against his own team, the Baltimore Colts, against the San Francisco 49ers. Robert McGarvey was Rosenbloom's personal aide from 1951 to 1954, and he said during this period, Mr. Rosenbloom bet frequently and in large amounts. When he felt his own team would not win, he bet against the Colts on such occasions. Larry Murphy, one of Rosenbloom's golf caddies, confirmed this in an affidavit. I know that he frequently bet on professional football games and many times bet against his own team. In the 1958 NFL championship game, Rosenbloom's Colts played the New York Giants. There have long been rumors that this game was fixed and that Rosenbloom had bet $1 million on the game. And this rumored bet is kind of a legendary NFL story, and you can find a ton of articles out there about it. Rosenbloom also financed and built a casino in the Bahamas and was part owner of a casino in Havana, Cuba, so this guy really loved to gamble. In 1972, Rosenbloom became owner of the LA Rams through possibly the strangest trade in sports history. That year, Rosenbloom traded his ownership of the Colts to Jim Irsay, who was owner of the Los Angeles Rams. It was an even, straight-up swap, the Colts franchise for the Rams franchise. With the Rams, there were even more allegations that Rosenbloom was betting on the team he owned. The Rams' entire 1978 season was very suspicious. They were 12-4 during 1978, which was the second best record in the league, but they were only 5-11 against the point spread, which was the worst record in the NFL that year. And if you know anything about sports gambling, you know that is unheard of. For a team with the second best record in the league to have the worst record against the point spread. Lead detective in the Weiss murder, Leroy Orozco, believed Rosenbloom's gambling habits played a part in Weiss's murder. He said Weiss and Carroll Rosenbloom were definitely associated. Rosenbloom trusted Weiss, who used to spend Sundays at home games with Rosenbloom or in the Rams press box. We know Rosenbloom was gambling, and we believe Weiss played some role in that. And a really interesting wrinkle to this story is that Rosenbloom died only 1.5 months before Weiss did, and his death is a massive mystery in itself. He supposedly died while swimming in Florida, but there are many who think he was murdered, including Rosenbloom's son Steve.
With all these circumstances in question still in my mind, I don't believe that his death was accidental.
Gino Tropiano has heard the story that's common in criminal circles.
I think he was more or less murdered. He was held underwater until he drowned.
After Rosenbloom died, ownership of the Rams went to his widow, Georgia Rosenbloom, better known as Georgia Frontier. Rosenbloom was Frontier's 5th husband, and shortly after his death, she married her 6th husband. Rosenbloom's death is a really bizarre case, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. We won't get into any more detail now, but we're going to have an entire video about his death coming out soon, so be sure to subscribe so you're notified when it's out. With both Rosenbloom and Weiss dead only 1.5 months apart, the investigation into the NFL's gambling ring fizzled out. But one of the more interesting things about Victor Weiss's murder was just how many people linked to him met untimely and suspicious deaths around this time. Jeffrey Rockman was a jewel thief linked to a Canadian crime syndicate who was being investigated for Weiss's murder when he was shot and killed on April 29, 1980. Horace McKenna was a former California state trooper who also strangely owned a number of topless bars. He was also investigated for his links to Weiss and was later killed when a gunman opened fire with a machine gun into the limousine McKenna was riding in. Gerald Cutter was Weiss's quote-unquote business associate who owned the car dealerships that Weiss worked at. He also owned Weiss's house and Weiss's Rolls Royce where his body was found. A year earlier, Cutter's wife died in a bizarre accident when her car fell off a cliff as she was backing out of their home's driveway. Authorities suspected foul play but could never prove it. Right after Weiss's murder in 1980, Cutter's cousin David Cutter was arrested for allegedly being involved in a sports gambling operation, and authorities found him in possession of 3 pounds of cocaine, worth $1 million on the streets. Ronald Lanius was a drug dealer with close ties to Weiss. On July 1st, 1981, he was killed in the Wonderland murders, one of the most notorious crimes in LA history. He was allegedly killed by Eddie Nash, and we talked about Nash in our videos on the Odyssey, a nightclub for teenagers he owned in Hollywood, and in another video where we covered his potential involvement in the murder of Robert Kennedy. Definitely check out those videos if you want to learn more on Nash. He was considered possibly the most brutal gangster on the West Coast during this time, and the fact that he has a roundabout connection to Victor Weiss's murder is definitely interesting. So there was a lot of death and mystery surrounding Victor Weiss's murder and a lot of unanswered questions too. We'll never know what would have become of the Lakers in the 1980s if Tarkanian had been named the coach in 1979, just as we'll most likely never know who was responsible for the murder of Victor Weiss.